This asynchronous PD is entitled Newcomer Ambassadors, using insightful intaking to build on the assets newcomers bring. The past and identity of newcomers are key to creating a pathway of belonging, well being, and success. My name is Margaret Gisala Rotacchio, and my current role is Newcomer Facilitator. You can follow me at agi_Rotacchio. I broke down this PD in three parts. Part 1 is the why, Part 2 is the how, and Part 3 is the call. It is very important to always begin with the why, because this is the one that helps us get into the goal and at the same time focus on why we are doing what we are doing. As I begin to show you the why, let me begin with a picture. This little picture right here shows my very first newcomer class back in 2007-2008. I know it's quite small, but I'm right there in red in the middle, together with my high school students. That was me back in 2008, many pounds ago. Just like a lot of these students, I went through the same experience as an immigrant. I left home to be able to find a better life in the United States. I went through acculturation, just like them, acclimatization, and assimilation. As my newcomer students were going through all of that, I was going through it with them as well. And I was very happy to be able to see them grow, and I was able to witness graduation for most of them. So those were my students when they were seniors already, right before they graduated. My journey to citizenship here in the United States was not easy. It took 15 years before I got my citizenship. So I understand every struggle and every best foot forward that my students had to do to be able to get to where they are right now, because I did the same thing. And that is all because of my beautiful family, my husband, and my two boys, Victor and Dan. For today's session, we will learn about a newcomer intake process that will help educators see how the past, identity, and assets of newcomers and all students can be utilized to create a pathway to success. Our demonstration of learning is I will write a response to the call on how I can share the knowledge to other educators and stakeholders. In this little heart collage, these are some of the names of some of the students that I have helped throughout the 15 years that I was here in the United States, working with newcomers, students with interrupted formal education, asylees, and refugees. In fact, most of the names there are the ones that were the most at-risk kids, the ones who were also SIFE or students with interrupted formal education, or maybe they're coming with uh, disability because they are dually coded. So I want you to think about your why. Think about those students that maybe you have already taught, or maybe if you're a new teacher that you think you're going to encounter, or maybe you've encountered during your time as a practice teacher. And as you think about this why, I would like to share a video with you. But before sharing that video, let me show you this graph. It says here from the Fearless organization that psychological safety is very important in terms of creating a learning environment that's safe for our students. If you will look at the bottom, it says low psychological safety with low standards will be the apathy zone or indifference zone. The one that's high standards but it's low psychological safety is going to create an anxiety zone. Now, if you have high psychological safety but you have low standards, it's going to be just a comfort zone. And kids would like you as a teacher, but really what's happening is that they don't want to move forward to do better in the class. But if you have a high psychological safety in the classroom or high standards as well, then you will have learning and high performance in terms of growth. This psychological safety is the same as the effective filter in the emergent bilingual or in the English learner world. The higher the filter an EB student or emergent bilingual student has, the lower the chances that they will speak and they will practice a second language in the classroom. But the lower the filter, think about it as like a wall. The lower the filter that the student has, then the more chances that they will speak in the classroom and try to do better as you are trying to support and help them. So, right before the video, I want you to think about that particular quadrant. You're going to watch a video about Byron. So, let's set the purpose for viewing. What about Byron's story resonated with you? In what way does the psychological safety quadrant apply in his story? As you are answering on your own, you can use the sentence stem or you can choose to use your own sentence. But here's the sentence stem you can use. Byron's story resonated with me by or because, and the quadrant applies true blank. So let's watch Byron's story.
Hi, my name is Byron Juan Bautista. I am from Guatemala, 70 years old. I am a student at MPA. Empecé a los 7 años, mi mamá me empezó me llevaba y todo, comenzó bien, ¿va? Y de ahí terminé eso y entré a la primaria. De ahí que entré a la primaria ya no fue lo mismo porque mi mamá empezó a trabajar con nosotros. Cuando llegué a la primaria ya no llevé el mismo curso que llevaba ya en Pablito, en kinder. Ya llevaba un quizás entre veces y de ahí ya más que todo ya nunca llevé dinero y yo me ponía así como ver a mis otros amigos que ellos tenían dinero y todo, más que todo hasta mi primo veía que él compraba sus cosas y todo, yo nada. En mi país fue como en el 2011 que dejé de ir y ya luego hasta acá donde estoy yendo a la escuela y estoy aprendiendo el inglés, pero no sabía pero absolutamente nada de leer en español ni escribirlo.
Byron has been one of my most loved students that I've had the privilege of teaching. Byron actually came to me midway through the spring of 2019 semester with very minimal education. But despite that, he continued to try his best in my class. He would come to all the one-on-one tutorials I set up for him. But despite all his effort that he was putting in, he continued to struggle in Algebra 1 curriculum. Now, fast forward to the fall of 2019 semester. I decided to set some really high expectations for Byron, and I told him he could no longer use the excuse with me that he hadn't completed elementary school in his home country. At times, Byron would get super frustrated with me of how strict I was being on him, but the progress he was showing was amazing, so I continued it.
My notebook for redstone notebook. The fish is red. The fish are red. The bicycle is yellow. The bicycle are yellow. I have red flowers. You have red flowers. Que están de, de escribir y yo entre veces no sé cómo escribirlo, va, lo paso y lo miro cómo lo escribo y tomo mis notas y ya luego lo pongo yo. Uno aprende del maestro y yo tengo que ver como que sea mi maestro en la aplicación y yo ver primero cómo lo hace la aplicación y para poderlo hacer yo. Ahora me estoy dando cuenta que ya voy aprendiendo un poco más de el inglés y ya puedo un poco escribir unas oraciones en inglés y ya leerlas también. Puedo hacer muchas cosas y llegarlas a hacer si yo propongo de mi parte y llegar a tener lo que yo quiero y lo que más ha querido hacer también. Cuando llegué a este país que me empezaron a impulsar en estudiar y todo y ha querido aprender mucho el inglés. El inglés es nuestra segunda lengua que debemos aprender y yo sé que el inglés es muy difícil para nosotros, pero algún día lo vamos a llegar a entender y también poner nuestro granito de arena de uno mismo y echarle ganas que sé que vamos a salir adelante juntos.
So the day that I gave Byron his Algebra 1 star score, he was super excited, super emotional. He could not believe he had scored that high on the Algebra 1 test, which I then went on to tell him, hey, Byron, you were actually 3 questions away from being at the meets level. Once I told him this, the emotion he had in his eyes, um, it just it grew even more. To him, scoring this high was not a possibility. Byron's confidence tremendously increased. He now feels a lot more confident in school, despite the gaps in his education.
So let's look back at the purpose for viewing. What about Byron's story resonated with you? In what way does the psychological safety quadrant apply in this story? You can use the SIM, Byron's story resonated with me by or because, and the quadrant applies true. You can use your handout to jot down and write down some of your thoughts. Resonated with you. I always begin with the why and use this story, his story, as an example of the great possibilities if we believe in the ultimate potential of our students. It also tells us that it's very important to know the challenges and the assets that they bring because these will help educators know how we can better support them. So let us get into the how. So before we get into the details of the how, let's look at some data that has driven it. Our district is a mid-sized district in the DFW area. And here's an overview of our EB or immersion bilingual population. As you can see, there are around 20,000 EBs out of about 50,000 in our district, and we have approximately 78 diverse languages other than English. We have around 70 campuses from elementary to secondary. In the past years, we've had students who are identified as newcomers, meaning that they are in the first 2 years in the country, and the number was around 500 plus each year. And that's a very big number. However, this year is simply unprecedented as we got around 1,000 newcomers by the end of January. So that's around roughly after one semester. And we are currently, as of April, 1,050 and still growing. Given these numbers, I have the daunting task of creating programming for all of these students, since I'm the only newcomer facilitator for the whole district. Around 200 plus of these newcomers are served in our newcomer center. This means that around 800 are spread out in 69 other schools. Thus, I had to think of a way to be able to reach all of them since I did not have the power of duplication or duplicating myself. If you remembered earlier, I had shared that I was an immigrant. The first time I ever left my country, I crossed the Pacific Ocean and went from one continent to another to find a better life. Since I have never traveled before, my first thought was, is there an embassy in Texas for my country? Will I be able to reach my country's ambassador if ever something happens to me, especially since I was traveling alone? Of course, I found out when I arrived that the nearest embassy was in California. But this experience and thought was probably the birth of my Newcomer Ambassadors program. Let's read the definition of these terms. Newcomers are students who are in their first year in the United States and are classified as non English speakers or in the beginning level of language proficiency. The term newcomer is an overarching nomenclature for different types of immigrants. They can have other indicators as well, such as S-Life or students with limited interrupted formal education, asylee, refugee, recent immigrant, and even migrant. What about ambassador? The term is derived from Middle English ambassadeur, Anglo French ambassadeur, meaning servant or minister. Ambassadors are also defined as official envoys or representatives with special assignments. The term is also associated with diplomacy. Thus, ambassadors carry out their duties with diplomatic demeanor, keeping in mind building cultural relationships successfully. Thus, in my head, there should be an ambassador for every newcomer on every campus, just like how usually your country would have an ambassador to help welcome you in every country that you go to. Although we know that there's always a teacher, para, administrator who will always welcome our kids, it's actually already happening. You actually have an ambassador in every campus. But you know what? It's still very important to name these people in the campuses and to ensure that there is one in every single campus. And why is that? Because there is power in a name. There is power in a name. Every school needs a newcomer ambassador. Here are some of the ambassadors that we have met. Wonderful ambassadors from one of the campuses, some of the campuses that we have in our district. This is the fourth year that we have been working with them, and we always try to celebrate them. So, what is the role of the newcomer ambassador? The newcomer ambassador in the campus is the main advocate for our newly arrived English learners or emergent bilinguals. They are the first friendly, welcoming face that they know they can approach. So if you really think about it, it's the first friendly person who will just say, "Hi, how are you? Don't worry, everything is going to be all right." I am here for you. So the ambassadors will help ease their transition as they begin their schooling life in the US. They will be their champion who will work with other stakeholders in the campus to help newcomers achieve their potential. One of the very first things I tell the ambassadors to begin with when supporting our newcomers is sharing the four important messages from the book Pathways to Greatness by Dr. Izquierdo. What are these four essential messages? Number one, you are important. Number two, what we're learning is important. Number three, you can do it. And number four, we will not give up on you. So, like I said earlier, we have to name who will be the ambassadors in every campus. So, here's an example from our district. The newcomer ambassadors in elementary are the ELL, or English Language Learner, or EL aides, or EB aides. The newcomer ambassadors in secondary are the LPAC teachers, since we have them in every campus. And of course, in the newcomer center, I tell every single staff there, you're all newcomer ambassadors. That is your role. And it's very important that you smile and give them the best experience, the best first experience that they have of the United States. Now, after naming the ambassadors, we can't leave them simply saying, hey, be the student's advocate without giving them a process and some tools. So this is where we will go to the next part of this, our three-step process for our newcomer ambassadors. It involves three steps. Number one, conduct newcomer interview or interviews to get to know the student and gather information. Number two, share the information to the administrator or the compliance administrator or LPAC administrator. Number three, the LPAC, or the Language Proficiency Assessment Committee, creates a newcomer support plan based on the strengths, assets, and challenges of the newcomer student. Now let's get into the details of these processes. Number one, the ambassadors will get to know the students and make them feel welcome. That begins with the four messages. They will also get to know them better through the Newcomer Achievement Plan interview and the SIFE, or Student with Interrupted Formal Education interview, if needed. These are actually resources that I will share with you today. Something to note, the interviews are first done in English, but an interpreter will be utilized if the student needs one. Next, partner with your translation and interpretation department if you have one in your school or district. Lastly, if possible, the interview questions about educational background are best done with parents or caregivers, especially for kids that are younger, but even with your older students as well. So now let's take a look at the tools that we have for the newcomer intake process. The first one that is linked here is the Newcomer Achievement Plan interview, and the second one is the Student with Interrupted Formal Education interview. We will click and I will show you and walk you through the form. So here's the copy of the Newcomer Achievement Plan form for sharing. It begins with the message for our newcomers. Number one, you are important. Number two, what we are learning is important. Number three, you can do it and we will not give up on you. Please note that parts of this were adapted from the book Pathways to Greatness by Dr. Michelle Izquierdo. I was able to get her permission and recreated the parts into this interview form that schools can use to be able to intake their students. So I do ask that when if you ever use this or recreate it, please acknowledge the creator, Margaret Gisala Rotacchio, and of course the information of the book from the book Pathways to Greatness by Dr. Michelle Izquierdo. So it begins with the information. What is the student ID? Where, is it happening? The particular interview. And very important that we know the home language of the student, what is the country of origin, and the interpreter. And of course, the newcomer ambassador who's conducting the interview. As you conduct the interview, I created a score point system. Score point 4, student was able to perform the task quickly and successfully. Score point 3, student was able to perform the task or parts of the task with some difficulty but was successful in the end. Score point 2, student was able to do part of the task but was not fully successful. And score point 1, student was unable to perform the task. So what are some of the tasks? They're pretty simple, but at the same time, it's very important that we do these things because what happens is that we don't know if the student has this basic skill or not. So some of these tasks are ask student to sort by color, ask them to sort, see if they know the difference between living and non-living things. See if they know numbers and alphabet. I've had some intake with some students wherein they didn't know any of the numbers and letters because they never had literacy in their in her home country. Are they able to distinguish between continents and oceans or landforms and water forms? Are they able to perform a math problem in their grade level? I usually begin with their math grade level and then I work my way down just to see if they are able to perform at a certain grade level. If they're third grade and up and they're taking the STAR test, are they able to use the dictionary? Because we might think, okay, let's give them a bilingual dictionary, but then they don't really know how to use the dictionary or they don't know the rules. So let's take a look at this, right? And see if they're able to use it. Ask the student about their school experience. This is very important. You always ask them like, what are the things you liked about your school in your home country? What are the things that you didn't like? Because that will give you a lot of insight on what are the things that they experience in school there. Because not all schools are comparable to the schools that we have here in the United States and the educational system as well. Is the student able to read in their first language? This is very important for language teachers and for literacy teachers because, as we know, research says that when you have literacy in the first language, the skills that you have can be transferred over, or you transfer that over to your second language, and you are able to make use of those skills. Ask the student if they have technology available at home. We can't simply assume that all kids have resources at home. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes we think that we should give them homework using the computer and using the internet, but they don't even have internet at home. Ask students about their first experience in learning technology. Why is this a crucial question? Most of the time, we think that students already know how to use a computer, but really, some kids have never seen a computer or even touched a computer until they came to the United States. We've had a lot of students like that. And so we take the time to show them this is where you turn it on. This is how you put in your ID number. This is where you put in your passcode or password. Ask student to describe his or her first experience of English. Some students are also coming with some language already, but they don't have the confidence to speak it. I know that because I'm the same. I had written language down, but I only develop, confidence later on in speaking because I don't use it every day. Once you've done the interview, jotted down your information and your observations, try to write three main goals for the student, at least the goal for the first 9 weeks or the first semester. Write a goal for cognitive, affective, and linguistic. Now, if you're new to it, you're thinking, what are those goals, right? What kind of goals do I write? So, if you're needing those goals, I also created a list of goals to be considered. Under cognitive, it says, for example, student will be provided and showed how to use a dictionary, just like what I mentioned earlier. Because we could not assume that the student would be able to know the rules of using a dictionary. For effective, I usually have the student uh, go to the newcomer ambassador and ask for help. Very important that they know who is my point person. I have my teacher, I have my newcomer ambassador. If I need help, if I'm in distress and I have something that I need to say, I can go to them and they will be my friend. Sometimes I also say, student will be taught homework process of the school. And this is also for the parents. Most of the time, some schools have their own set of resources that they use for homework. And we think sometimes that the students are not doing their homework, but there's different processes like a remind app, a planner, there's seesaw. And if the parents are also challenged in terms of technology, then it's going to be so hard for them to be able to help their students. So this is a parent piece that's very important. It also says here students will be provided with tutorial times and parents will be informed about early arrival or late pickup if necessary. This is important to communicate with the parents because we don't know if they are dependent on the school bus or if they're able to provide a ride for their student. For linguistic, maybe your school has Rosetta Stone, Duolingo, Imagine Learning, whatever app that you have, you can put that as a linguistic goal. So this is the first interview that we have. Again, this interview is called the Newcomer Achievement Plan Interview, and it's based on the book Pathways to Greatness by Dr. Michelle Izquierdo. So earlier, we had the Newcomer Achievement Plan interview. That is the first interview that you can conduct with every newcomer that's going to come into your school for the first time. That interview with the scoring system should give you some ideas if you need a second interview. One of the examples that I gave earlier is that, let's say the student is in a higher grade level and maybe they've never skipped school in terms of the schooling history, but then they cannot read. So you might be thinking, is there something else? Or you might also delve into the fact that maybe their schooling background is not up to par as to what we have in the United States. There are many different cases that could happen. And so this second interview will help you find out whether there's other things that you need to know about the student in order to be able to support them and help them better. So here are the guidelines for identifying students with limited and or interrupted formal education. On this particular form, there are definitions from Texas Education Agency. There's also other definitions from other resources. There's different guidelines that will say use the questions as a guide to fill out the spaces on the information below. And if possible, have kids write the information themselves to see if they can do it. One of the basic things that I see sometimes is that the very first thing, I gave a paper to a student and I asked them to write their name. And if they are in a higher grade level and they couldn't even write their name, or it's very hard for them to write basic information, then that's already a red flag for me to be able to know, okay, what are the other things that I can do to support this student? So there's the basic information. As much as possible, it's very important, like I said earlier, to have the guardian there and of course to ask permission to interview. So here are some of the questions that makes this interview a little bit different from the first one. One of the questions that I asked here is, what are the months of the school year in your country? In the United States, we begin around August going to May or September going to June. In other countries, sometimes they begin in June and end in March. Some countries begin in January and end in November. So sometimes kids, let's say, go in November, finish school in November, and then they go on a vacation, and then they don't come back to school or don't go to school in the United States until August of the next year. So that would count for so many months of lost schooling. One of the other things that I would ask is, when was the last time you attended school? Because this will help the student and you to find out, okay, how many days, weeks, or months did they miss? Important question, what was the school like? So if you remember in the newcomer interview, there was a question about school. Now you're going to ask more questions to delve deeper into what are the things that are there in terms of finding out about the school. What is the school like? What is a typical school day in your country? There are many countries that are doing half day elementary school. And here in the United States, even the pre K students now in Texas are going whole day. Can you describe your classroom? There are some classrooms in different parts of the world that have so many grade levels in the same classroom. Another question that's important here is, how far was your home from your school? How long did you have to travel? Can you describe the conditions? There are some students that would say, every time it rains, we don't go to school because it's going to be very muddy. Or we have to cross rivers to be able to go to school. That's why we haven't been consistently going. But it seems like they're going every year, but it's really not very consistent. I always ask them what their favorite subject is, and if they had the teacher for every class, how many students were in your classroom. I used to be in a third world country, and I used to teach a class of about 60 kids. So if I have 50 to 60 kids in a classroom, and here in the US, it's only about 20 to 30 kids, there's a big difference in terms of learning as well. Did they use books? Did they have books for every class? There were some students that I interviewed that said we only had one book for a group of 10 kids. So it's going to be a little bit difficult to be able to learn. Does the student like to read? What are the things that they love to read? Again, the question about smartphone, technology, internet access, just to make sure so that you can provide or ask your technology person to provide that device for home. And this is one of my favorite questions for kids. What do you want to be when you grow up and why? I always want to ask this question because I feel like it's such a great opportunity. Like I mentioned to you earlier, I'm an immigrant, and being in the United States is one of the most important things that ever happened to me because I know that this is the land of opportunity. A lot of these kids are coming from different places, and sometimes they're coming from hardship. So I always want them to know that America is the place for dreams. And so they can dream big, dream the biggest dream that they possibly could. So this is a very important question for me. Now, as you go through all of these questions and write down your notes about the student, there's two sets of checklists. The first one is about the quantity of time. Did the students miss number of years in schooling in home country or another country, or did they miss number of years of schooling within the United States? Because that has happened with some kids. Or did the student miss months, or they just simply had very limited or inconsistent experience attending school? So set one is more of time. Set two is the student did not have access to books and educational resources, did not have access to teachers, and did not have access to teachers teaching in grade level, or simply that the schooling situation, refugee camp, day school, outside classroom, and others from where the student came from was unable to give an adequate amount of time and proper basics or rudiments for the students to be able to function on a grade level in US schools. I've intake some students that came from a refugee camp, And some of those refugee camps that are coming from some other countries outside the country, their main thing is about teaching the kids about sanitation. So it's not really about academics, and we're thinking that they're studying every single year. So it's better not to assume, but just find out more information on how we can support our students, and write notes if there are other things outside. So this is the questionnaire for sharing. Again, I ask that you acknowledge the creator. So this questionnaire and process was created by me, Margaret Rutacchio, newcomer facilitator. And a lot of these questions, actually, I based it on my own experiences in taking kids and also coming from home country. So now we've seen what the first step entails. We went through the newcomer achievement plan interview. We went through the SIFE interview. But remember that this first step is very crucial because it's the data gathering step of the process. But now, what do we do with the data? That's very important. So, number two is once the newcomer interviews are done, the data gathered from the interviews will be shared with the LPAC, or the Language Proficiency Assessment Committee, and the LPAC administrator. Then, what do we do? Number three, the LPAC administrator, together with other stakeholders, it could be the teacher, the newcomer ambassador, EB para, it could be other persons like the coaches in the school, will then create a specific newcomer support plan for the student. Why is it important to do a newcomer support plan that's catered to the student? That is the reason why we did the interviews in the first place. We want to be able to look at their strengths and weaknesses. Remember Byron earlier. He had um, a very hard time when he was growing up, and he had 8 years of gap in schooling, and yet he was able to get to a point wherein he took algebra tests for the first time and passed it, and that's all because of his grit, and that's all because we tried to find out his story. So what are some examples? So let's say you have a newcomer who is who had education from home country. So it could be a simple plan like this. The student will be taught how to use a dictionary, just like what we put in the cognitive, affective, and linguistic plan. Student will be taught to ask help from the newcomer ambassador, and student will be utilizing Rosetta Stone for 15 minutes every small group time. That is for the students that have lower needs because they do have strengths of education in their home country. But what if the student is a newcomer and is also SIFE, or maybe an unschooled asylee or refugee? So the cognitive can have more details. For example, student will utilize the lab every morning and have a schedule for use for resources. So there's, let's say, Monday and Tuesdays Imagine Espanol, Wednesday and Thursdays Imagine Learning. And then effective student will be taught to ask help from the ambassador and will also have a mentor and a bilingual pair. Number three, linguistics student will be given a device for home to use Rosetta Stone, not just during the small group time. And the student will maybe go and attend after school virtual tutorial, will be asked to attend an intersession or a summer school. It just depends on the specific need of the student. The higher the number of years of interrupted education, then the more possibly the more support the student needs. One of the things that we did give the student is give them a chance to do after school virtual tutorial, and this started during COVID. All of these students sometimes have, like I mentioned to you, parents that are also newcomers. So it's very hard for them to teach them at home language and also to help them with their homework. So these are some of the things that we were able to provide for the students using our Title III funds. We also conducted challenges depending on the resources. So, for example, you can do a Rosetta Stone challenge if you have this in your district. We also do a winter, sometimes a fall challenge, depending on how we want to encourage our students. All of these things are part of the newcomer support plan. Every campus will create their own support plan based on how their students' needs and the resources of their campus, plus the ones that are also working at the district level, like me. Really, the main goals for creating the newcomer support plan are: first, help ease the transition of newcomers on their first year in US schools. Grow them to at least one language proficiency level in TELPAS at the end of the school year. If you think about it, the goals may seem simple, but these goals and the process behind it encompass taking the time to get to know a newly arrived student and giving them a way to show who they are, their weaknesses and strengths, so that as educators, we can give them a pathway to belong, to feel welcomed and safe, and have a supported way to success. So now let's go to the last part of our PD. The call is going to be the epitome of what it's like to be a newcomer ambassador. From my perspective, after working so many years with newcomers, it is crucial that the processes I created be shared so that newcomers in other places, other school districts, even in other parts of the country can have the same opportunity to be heard and their assets brought to light. So the call is really a question. What are your thoughts about the process of the newcomer intake, the newcomer ambassador program, and the newcomer support plan? In your own role as a teacher, or as a future teacher, as an administrator or a parent, what is the impact of this information? Who should you share it with and how? You can use the sentence time below as you fill out your form, or you can write your own. Please don't hesitate to email and ask me for questions or any support or PD. My email is aggierotacchio@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your time today, and please get in touch. My handle for Twitter is at Aggie Rotacchio underscore Rotacchio, and my email is also there. Thank you so much for this opportunity to learn with you. Have a good day.